Hello, I'm Ollie and this is Criminally, where I talk about crime, pulp, horror, that kind of thing. Today I want to talk to you about the way that some ways of telling stories are considered better than others. So what do I mean by that? Well, I've been thinking recently about this, and this follows on from a couple of videos that have gone up for Garb August. One by Andrew from It Came From The Page, and one by Nick from another BookTube channel, which both talked about novelisations. So novelisations being, novel adaptations of movies or TV shows, typically, sometimes video games as well. And Andrew in particular, in his video, talked about the fact that novelisations tend to be, frowned upon and considered to be trashier, whereas books that get turned into movies, or movies based on books, are, and not a problem at all. Nobody's got a problem saying that, The Godfather is a great movie, despite the fact that it was based on a book. But people, don't line up to applaud, say Alan Dean Foster's novelisation of the movie Alien. So why is that? Why do we as a society seem to think that movies based on books are absolutely fine, but books based on movies are not? And it's an interesting question, and it's one that's kind of been swirling around in my mind a bit. And I think I've kind of landed on the concept that there's like a ranking of ways of telling stories, of like media that you could tell stories in. That we as a society, and particularly probably like academics and things like that, tend to keep going back to when they're trying to determine the relative quality of things. So at the top you've got poetry, and poetry isn't necessarily something we use to tell stories anymore, but I think it is probably the most respected form of writing by academics and people like that. And obviously, poetry has a lot of its origins in storytelling. So, a lot of the original poems that remain are, epic poems like the Iliad and so on. So originally used by people as a way to remember stories and be able to, relay those stories to other people. So then after that you've got plays. So, the theatre and playwriting, hugely respected by critics and academics as a means of expression and of storytelling. Then just below plays you've got novels. Novels, books generally, people rate books as a way of telling stories, and novels as being a very good way of telling, particularly a longer story perhaps that needs a bit of time to breathe. After that you've got movies. Movies I think are coming to be, have come to be probably since the middle of the 20th century, and particularly, in the latter half of the 20th century, more and more respected as a way of telling stories, as a means of communicating ideas and plots and characters to audiences. Then you've got kind of comics and TV, and I think TV is probably still more respected than comics, but I think comics are becoming more and more respected, and it's probably since the early 90s with the kind of birth of graphic novels and things like The Watchmen and Dark Knight Returns and things like that, starting to get critical attention from people who weren't comic readers. So I think comics have come a long way and are still doing well, but probably didn't really build on that. Didn't really build on that period, that boom period in the 80s and 90s, late 80s and 90s, where they suddenly, everyone was talking about them. TV, on the other hand, I think has grown and grown over time. And if you think about, kind of the TV of the 50s and 60s, where, particularly in the States, it was network TV, it was very much driven by advertisers. So advertisers, would have a degree of say over what was in the shows that they were advertising, particularly if they were sponsoring a show, to moving into that same kind of time period when graphic novels took off. So kind of late 80s, early 90s, when you get stations like HBO, so paid TV, starting up, where the people making the TV shows had more creative control over what they were doing. Much more recently, obviously, you've had the boom in streaming and some really interesting shows getting made by by streaming services, where they can reach a much wider audience pool, so they don't need to necessarily appeal to everybody. They can appeal to niches and know that those niches of audience members will find their content. And then after that, you've got video games. So video games are a valid method of telling a story, but because of their origins as something much simpler. If you think about movies, when they started, were very simple things, trains coming out of tunnels and things like that, literally just spectacle. Video games, because of their origins as a game rather than a storytelling method, I think have less respect and still need time to build up as a way of telling stories, but they're certainly starting to do that. And the fact that the game The Last of Us has been so successfully translated into a TV show recently shows that there is that potential for great stories to be born out of video games. So that's kind of my ranking list, and when I look at that ranking list, it's actually also a chronological list. So those are, the list I've given there is basically the order that those methods of storytelling, first came into being. So I think part of this question of, snobbery and people valuing some forms of storytelling more than others is largely down to how long those forms of storytelling have been around, how big an influence they've been able to have on our culture as a result of them having been around for a long time. So you think about if you think about going to the theatre at a classic play, you probably or quite possibly think about Shakespeare. Now, Shakespeare's plays are centuries old. The poems of Homer are even older. So those things have really had time to build their influence on society. And similarly, novels. So the boom of novels in kind of the 18th century. 18th and 19th century. There's been a long time for novels, for individual novels and authors to have had an influence, but also for the art form to mature and develop and evolve. Whereas things like video games are much more recent and more obviously commercial. So TV, I spoke a bit earlier about the influence of advertisers on what was actually on TV. TV from the start, certainly in the US, probably less so in the UK, but certainly in the US, very much a commercial endeavour. And so that does, that shapes the kind of stories that can be told by it, and I think does make a difference. And then there's one other category which I didn't talk about, which is digital only books. So are digital only books valued less by society than printed books? And I think they are. I think there's a perception that books that are, particularly books that are self-published but that are only published digitally, have somehow less value and less permanence than physical books. And that may partly because they do, in a way they do have less permanence. They are not physical objects. But it's interesting. I think people are more likely to turn their nose up at a book if it's only been published digitally than the same book if it was, if they'd seen it in a bookshop or something like that. So a bit of a rambly video today, but just some thoughts from me. So do let me know what you think in the comments. Let you know if you think I'm talking complete nonsense or if you agree with me. And as always, thanks very much for watching. Hope you're safe and well out there. Hope you're reading good stuff. And I'll speak to you again very soon. Cheerio.